That is the topic today. This is the current events. It's going to be a short presentation. At least that's my expectation. And what we're going to be talking about is this idea that there are empires that rise up and fall down again. And not just that, but they seem to be interrelated. And so this graph here is part of something from another person I'll talk about in just a moment. And he's presenting that idea that, for example, in navy blue here, this is the rise of an empire. So in time, which is along this scale, he is describing a country that was insignificant, practically nothing at the beginning, and it comes up with a right idea. It's either a new idea or a new way of doing things. It's something that makes them better than the empire that was there before, and they begin shooting up, and they're having great success and doing wonderful things at the time that this empire is collapsing. And so this empire has become corrupt and fat and lazy and all sorts of bad things. And it's on its way down already. And this one is the rising star, and it comes up. And partly it affects the destruction of the old empire because the old empire tries to compete against it, but it is so full of corruption and everything else that it can't do a good job of that, and it winds up hurting itself more than it tries to hurt or help itself. And so that's the idea here, is that these empires increase over time, but they too become corrupt and useless, fat, lazy, and become worse and worse over time. And they begin their decline, and then there's always somebody who's there ready to pick up when this empire is in decline as well. And then so that's the idea we're looking at here, is that there's a pattern in the rise and fall of empires that we can look at, and we can see those steps that an empire takes when it starts, and the good things that it does when it starts, and then how it becomes corrupt and becomes worse and worse over time, and eventually collapses and becomes pretty much nothing again in the future. So that's what we're going to be looking at really quickly here. And then this comes from this guy that I mentioned, Ray Dalio. The idea isn't original with him, but the charts that I'm using here are original with him. And so what he did was he went back and looked at the past 500 years of economic history to see the empires that had existed and why they came into power and how they fell apart and how the next empire came and all of that. So he saw that there's definitely a pattern to this, that empires rise and fall according to a particular pattern, and each one repeats that pattern, but it can be different between them. They're not identical for sure. Some of them last a short time, some last a long time, and that's because some of them take longer to become corrupt, and some of them actually try to fix the problems that they're having, and they extend their existence by doing that. And so he saw that there's a pattern to all of this rising and falling of empires, and especially saw that one empire is falling, it opens up the room for a new empire that is already rising. So it always seems like there's one that's ready to jump up just as the old one is collapsing. And so this Ray Dalio guy makes an assumption that I think is a bad assumption. He assumes that has always been the case, that there's always been a previous empire that has existed before the upcoming empire, and the upcoming empire eventually becomes corrupt, and it becomes the falling empire, and there's another one to come right away up from that one. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. And he also assumes that it will always be the case, that there will always be another empire after the current empire, whatever it is. And so his definition of an empire here is a country whose currency is the reserve currency for others. Now, that's a very technical description, but basically it means that other countries that are around this empire, and it might be a great distance around in a large empire, have decided to hold on to some of that empire's currency. These other countries are doing that. And they're doing that so they can trade with the current empire country, because that current empire country has all the right ideas, they're doing all the right things, producing the products that you want to buy. So you want to exchange with them. And to do that exchange with them, you have to be able to work in a currency that they want to work in. So these other countries that are the neighbors of this empire country are storing its currency for themselves so that they can trade with the empire country. And so, as I said, this idea is not a new one. I heard of it first like 30 years ago, and it probably existed before that time. People had seen this pattern, and you even see that in the Bible. The Bible talks about that, and the Bible says God raises up nations and takes them back down again. And we see the examples of that in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we saw the Assyrian Empire attack Israel, and we know that that empire was near the end phase of its existence because when God destroys the army there and the king goes back to his home country and is killed by his sons, and the sons run off so that they aren't hurt, that's the end of the empire. It collapses right then and there. And so that was the Assyrian Empire. And as soon as the Assyrian Empire collapsed, there's the Babylonian Empire. And they're all ready, and they have this new idea about doing things. And they rise up and they become the next big empire. But they become really lazy and really useless and arrogant, and they, in very short time, they're gone. And the one that picks up from them is the Medo-Persian Empire, and they step in, and they become the great empire. And each one of these is becoming bigger as it goes along. So the Assyrian Empire was smallish, but the Babylonian Empire was larger, although it didn't last very long. And now the Medo-Persian Empire is an even bigger empire. And so these empires seem to grow over time, and all of this happens. So the Medo-Persians come in, and they have a new way of thinking. Their new way of thinking is when you conquer a country, you don't take all of their people as slaves to your home country. Instead, you leave them to work in their own countries, and you tax them, and you or take from what they earn. And so that's a better way. And so you don't pollute your own country with bad ideas and bad people. You let them be your tax slaves. And so that was how they innovated. And so that was the Medo-Persian Empire. They changed, and that's why they let Israel go back to their home country. And so after the Medo-Persian eventually became corrupt and fat and lazy, in comes the Greek Empire, and the Greek Empire takes out the Medo-Persian Empire, and very shortly the Greek Empire becomes corrupt and useless, and then there's the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire is really big and strong and powerful, and it manages to live something like 700 years. That's a very long time for an empire to last. But nonetheless, it becomes corrupt and useless and has a whole bunch of enemies, and they begin tearing it down. And it becomes a situation where there are barbarian hordes running through Rome, killing all the people they can find. And so these things always seem to happen in this same cycle, and that's the idea that we're going to be looking here and on this next slide here. And so this is from Ray Dalio still. And so the cycle that he talks about begins with a country that has that new idea, that new way of doing things, whatever it is that makes them unique, and everybody wants to be on that boat. And that leads to peace and prosperity and productivity. And so their successes make them more productive, and the productive makes them more wealthy, and that prosperity begins to corrupt them. And what happens is they begin to do things that they wouldn't have done before, because they now have a lot more time because of the money that they have. They have more free time, and they use that free time to get themselves into trouble and do things that they shouldn't do. And so this creates a financial bubble, and it creates a wealth gap also that has often been a problem in countries. If you get too many people who are really poor, desperately poor, and there's an upper class that is absolutely filthy rich, and nobody in the middle, you can get into a situation where the people who are poor say, well, why don't we just chop the heads off of the people who are rich and take all their money? And so you have to make sure that you avoid that in any country. But this wealth gap is something that begins to occur, and is something that occurs in all of these countries, is that the success doesn't get spread evenly over everybody. And then in the later stages, it's beginning to decline. People are making bad decisions. And a lot of that is because they don't even remember what they were back in these younger days. They don't remember the attitudes. They don't remember the reasons that made them wealthy and successful. They know none of that things. And so they make a bunch of bad decisions. And these bad decisions are actually hurting the engine that made them wealthy and prosperous and productive. And so the bad decisions begin to lead to financial busts and economic downturns, and all sorts of inflation things happen. All of that begins to be a problem that tears into the country. Now, as this country was coming up, there was a country here who was going down, and that happens kind of around this point in here. And now this country on its way down is in that point where there's usually somebody there who's going to pick up the difference, because this thing has become so corrupt and useless that it's not functioning well anymore. And one of the last stages is they begin to print money and credit. So they just start generating money, paper money or whatever it is. Or in the case of the Romans, it was silver coins that had very little silver in them. Same idea. And so this corruption that has come a part of them leads them to do things that are really, really bad. And then in the very latest stages, there are revolutions and wars inside of the country or sometimes with neighboring countries. And those lead to the weakening of the empire that existed. And then at the very last they tried to do some debt and political restructuring and try to fix their problems. But by now, when they're at this stage now, they simply can't. All of the foolish laws that they made up here are making it impossible to restructure things because they can't change those laws. And also, there are always a lot of people here who reject the reality and say, no, we're the great empire that we ever were, and this is foolish to think that we are somehow less than we ever were. And so that's how it spirals into the ground, is that it goes in that way because they simply can't make the changes they need to make to fix themselves in most cases. So, so that's the pattern that you see in all of these empires that rise up and decline. And I want to highlight a couple things here. This is where we are right now because we're in that printing money and credit stage. Some people could argue that we've also seen the beginning of wars with the Black Lives Matter and things like that, internal wars that are starting to tear us apart. So maybe we're somewhere in this area here, but generally we're on that downside part of the curve. And so and unless something amazing happens, then we're going to continue on down this curve. And there have been times when decisions were made by a country where they were able to extend this out and it didn't happen later, but ultimately it's going to get you. There are enough people who are corrupted in the country that you just can't fight back. Now, back in the Ronald Reagan years for us up here, he began to try to make some changes there. But he didn't have a lot of effect. Even back then, when things weren't so bad, that he couldn't have a lot of effect to to turn the wheel of the country and point it in a new direction. And so that's just what happens. Once you get to this part of the slide, it's really, really hard to get out of the slide and stop from heading right to the bottom. And so now Ray Dalio thinks of all of this in terms of economics. Well, not just in economics. He recognizes that there's also a moral factor here, and that's really what I want to look at here. Is this moral factor is the causation of this, and it causes the greatness and it causes the corruption and collapse. And so what happens and what you see in all of these countries is that they have a moral standard. They are moral people. Now, it might not be Judeo-Christian morals exactly, but they have that same basic understanding that of what is right and wrong and good and all of those sorts of basic moral ideas. Don't steal people's stuff. Don't hurt people. Don't kill people. Those basic ideas that you do see founded in the Ten Commandments uh, even for countries that never knew the Ten Commandments, they begin their strength with a morality and a basic morality code. And that morality also involves justice. So if you treat people fairly, everybody gets treated the same. Those basic justice ideas are in there. And the other thing that you see in all those countries when they start out is that they are innovative. They've come up with some great new idea that is making them very powerful and allowing them to really succeed. And in the case of the US, that I'm going to speak about here in a little bit, that innovation was really the idea of liberty and justice for all. And so what that did was it meant that the Europeans were in a class or a caste system, it's called, and so different people were stuck at different levels in the caste. And if you were in the lower levels of the caste, you had no opportunity to ever move up. And what America really did was it threw out that whole class caste system and said every man can contribute according to what his gifts are. And that made us innovative. That was a really big new idea. Europeans simply weren't doing that at the time. And so this big innovation allowed everybody to contribute to society in whatever ways it was possible for him to contribute. And so you got more out of the people in your country because each one could contribute to the full capacity of how he was able to contribute. And what you also see in these countries that start out becoming empires is that they are hardworking. They accept the idea that they're going to need to work for this, and without work, it's not going to succeed. And so in the later stages, what you see is you see that increasing wealth, and the increasing wealth poisons them. It leads them to explore lower moralities and to do things that they wouldn't have done in these people. Now, usually there's a generation or two, or sometimes many generations between these steps in the curve. And so they don't accept the old moral ideas. They want to explore looser morals. They're less just. They start to think that it's fair to treat people some people badly. and they're certainly less hardworking, and that's very natural. Once you start to have money and success, you want to lay back and take it easy. And that lay back and take it easy is the poison that kind of kills off the country ultimately, and along with all the moral failures. Okay, so this corruption is beginning to happen here, and it's being caused by success and wealth that comes with success. And they become less of what they were and further away from what they were when they were beginning the empire. And so up here, as I mentioned before, a bunch of bad decisions start to happen. And these bad decisions start to turn the country so that it is headed in the wrong direction. And the result of that is economic, okay, and bad laws, and also a feeling of entitlement. This generation here begins to think that the empire will always exist and it always has existed, and that's just the way it is. They start to not understand that the empire had a start and it could have a finish, and they just think that this is how life should always be, and they expect that to be the way it will always be. And that's a really false assumption and a bad idea. That's the entitlement idea that we are great just because we're great, and we have no understanding of what made us great. And so what all of this begins to lead to is a self-centeredness, and really what the decay continues on in morality, and all sorts of unusual moralities start being taught and feeding through the whole culture, and even affecting other cultures. The empire becomes kind of a leader of other countries. Back at this point here is when its currency became the currency of all the other countries. And not just the currency becomes to spread around to other countries, but the ideas of this empire begin to get spread around to the other countries that it deals with too. And so it begins to infect the others with that. And so, and then later on in those stages, you start to see things like justice disappearing, and instead of justice being in place, what you see is preferred groups. There are certain groups that are considered to be better than other groups. And so that becomes to be back in the American case, it becomes to be back to the class system, the caste system, and where there are people who are at certain levels in society and always will be, and they can't move up or down. And in the case of the U.S., that's a really fatal flaw because that's not how we started. And so, and then you also start to see relative morality, where morality is different for one group or different for me than others. And so all these really bad ideas about morality and preferences and justice start to really fall apart badly here. And then what you see at the moral layer is hating, killing, lying, cheating, stealing, and your society is really falling apart here. These are internal fights that people are having, and the value of life starts to go down, and things are really falling apart. Generally, the country is tearing itself apart at this level. And then more of the same continues on, and that's how that goes. And so that's really the moral view of this. And the morals of the people are what leads to the rise and the decline of the empire in its economy and everything else that it does. And it always starts out this way. It starts out with this moral, just, innovative, and hardworking people. And it always gets worse and worse over time. And a big part of that is that people just don't know what it was to start that country, what the people were like, and they also begin to drift off into immorality and various kinds of immorality. And we see that in all of the previous empires. The Roman Empire is kind of the classic one that we look at a lot because we're very similar to them. And falling morality is definitely how they ended up. And so I'm going to touch quickly now on why can't we plan for this? Why can't we say, okay, this country's in decline? I touched a little bit on how hard it is to try and get it back onto the path of success and how that has never really worked. And we can't plan because the outcome depends on actions that are yet to be taken. And we see that with Britain and Rome because they both had different endings. Britain right now still has some power in the world. It's still a somewhat of a force, and it was the British Empire was the one before us, and the Roman Empire, however, was completely destroyed. As I mentioned before, it got to a point where barbarians were running through Rome, slaughtering people. But even before that point, the center of Rome had been moved out of Italy and was now in Constantinople, and most of the Romans had moved to Constantinople. And so the Romans didn't just lose their empire, they lost their country. And so Rome basically moved to Constantinople and and became completely nothing. So the Italy that exists now and the Rome that exists now are really just museums of what was once a great empire. none of that greatness still exists. So you can't tell what the final outcome of this crash is going to be as part of your problem. It depends on what the people do who are making the decisions. And it could be that the empire continues on in a much weakened form, or it could be that it's just completely wiped out and disappears. And the difference here seems to be dependent on the empire's ability to accept its fate. And I have a quote from Tennyson, which I actually first heard from a Bond movie. Um, but it's a good one about this, accepting that you were once a great thing, and that you're not that thing anymore, but you are what you are. And so from Tennyson, it says, "We are not now that strength which in old days moved heaven and earth and heaven. That which we are, we are." And so this idea is that the British Empire really accepted its fate at the end of World War II, that it had got into so much debt and it wasn't going to be able to be the empire anymore. And it signed on to the idea that the US would be the new power, the new empire that would lead the earth. And because they were able to do that and not fight to the bitter end like the Romans did, it was possible for them to retain some of their existence and some of their empire and some of their political force. And so if the empire is determined to fight to the bitter end, the end will be bitter. And that's just the way it's going to go. So if the country doesn't know any better than to give it up, it won't go well. And so just as a note here, in 2006, Britain made its last payment on its war debt to the US. And so paying off that war debt crippled Britain for a very, very long period of time. Okay, now what's coming next is the question. So we can see that we're going down and almost certainly will continue to go down. Um, and Ray Dalio believes that China is next, but I really believe he's wrong on that. And this is his diagram fully expressed out. So he shows the Dutch Empire, which came first. We don't know much about that. We know a lot more about the British Empire, which came after it, and the American Empire, which we are now in here. And as he shows, as I showed, we're at this stage of collapse. He believes the Chinese are next, and I think that that's wrong. Um, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. Part of the decline in the previous empire is due to the next empire's rise, and they compete and maybe they even war against each other is part of that pattern. And the new empire does kind of tend to take down the old empire, but China doesn't match any of the definitions for starting a new big empire. We saw that a new big empire is always started by hardworking, moral, and just people who have an innovation. And none of that is China. Well, that's not true. China has a lot of hardworking people in that. But morality is a problem there. Justice is a big problem in China. It's hard to get justice in that kind of a totalitarian environment. And innovation certainly is quashed by totalitarianism. As soon as people start getting the freedom to innovate in a totalitarian society, the first thing they want to do is kill off all of their masters, all of their politicians. And we've seen that in China. We've seen people trying to revolt, and when that happens, the totalitarian government there has to step in and stomp on everybody. And so they quash innovation just by their nature. And so it doesn't make any sense that China would ever be able to become an innovative, great country with that kind of a government. And they're also economically different from every other power. All of the economic empires of the past always had that ability to succeed. And so the harder you work, the more you were paid. But totalitarianism and socialism don't go with that. They tend to try to spread the money around. So the harder you work, the better off somebody else is. And so that is a real problem with China as well, is that it doesn't spread the money around in a just way. Um, and China has already had its time in the sun. They're on the downslope themselves. And they have a lot of big problems coming up. If you've done some study of them, they've got population problems, demographic problems. They've got economic problems. Their economy is overbuilt in foolish ways, and there's been a lot of really bad decisions that have been made there. And they're really a lot like Japan was in the 1960s. If you, some of us were alive at that time, and we remember that there was a time when Japan was really the innovative power, and there were a lot of people thinking that Japan was going to be the one who replaced the US because they were coming out with all the hot new ideas. The Japanese transistor radios, the Japanese cars. At first, the Japanese cars were not great quality, but after a little while, they fixed up the quality, and so they became top quality cars at low prices, and they were able to really outcompete the US. But what happened with them is that they ran into a corruption problem with themselves, and they've kind of fallen away there. They didn't have some of the things that they needed to really succeed. And so Japan right now isn't a big force in the world economically. And so because China just doesn't seem like it could ever be the next major power, it doesn't have any of those basic requirements that you see in all of the other major empires. I don't believe it could be the next one. And so if it's not the next one, then what's going to happen? And so I really think that this is the changeover point. Go ahead.
Can I just add something just quickly?
Yeah.
So in the part about China, you're completely correct. I totally agree with that. Thank you for this presentation. It's awesome. China and Russia and countries like them, they're at the very core, they are socialists, they are communist. And so even if they try, or when they try to be a capitalist society or a nation, they won't do it because their thinking is not that way. They're communist socialists, and they can just implode at any time because they don't know how to run a capitalist society or nation.
Yeah, and and China has been trying to do that. They've been trying to become a socialist layer on top of a capitalist layer, but we've seen that that doesn't work because the first thing that what people do when they start to get some money and stuff is they want to get rid of that socialist layer who's making all the stupid laws that are limiting them. And so when you've got a country built like that, it just can't succeed. It's a matter of time until it collapses. Yeah, that's all quite right. And so I believe something completely different is next. And we can look back at the history. And I mentioned that Ray Dalio believes that these cycles have been continuing from the beginning of time, and they will always continue to the beginning to the end of time. But that's not what we see in history. When we look at the Roman Empire, when it collapsed, what was the empire that came after it? Well, there wasn't. The Roman Empire just collapsed and vanished, and there was no empire. What happened, or what did happen in that time, was the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, and there was nothing going on for almost 1,000 years, and no empire at all. And I think that that's coming again for us. I think that that's what we're seeing here. There's nobody coming up who's going to be the replacement for the U.S. And so for some period of time, there's going to be no empire. And it'll be just a whole bunch of countries probably struggling and maybe even warring. And then I think that this is going to lead into the 10-toed empire that the Revelation and Daniel talk about, is that it talks about a 10-toed empire being formed from these remnant countries that are left over after the collapse of the current, whatever we want to call it. Okay, so that's all I have to say.